Greek historian Herodotus wrote that Greece had a faithful friend in poverty. It's a strange thing to say about a land that was considered glorious, proud, undefeatable, elegant, and cultured. Yet, that's how things were. Many Greeks earned their livelihood through trade, others with fine crafts. But the dry, stony, barren, and infertile Greek soil produced very little. From the 8th century BC, the Greeks started emigrating, mostly to the west, toward Italy and Sicily, a very fertile land, and in an ideal position for trade, since it was in the middle of the Mediterranean sea lanes. While excavating on Sicily, archaeologists realized that around the middle of the 4th century BC, many cities expanded into new quarters, often far from the coast. They found numerous buildings in the interior of the countryside. What was the cause of this population explosion and shift in locations? By consulting ancient historical texts, especially those written by Plutarch, scholars came across a very important event. In 339 BC, the Greek colonies on Sicily defeated the Phoenician colonies in the west in a memorable war at Himera. They thereby laid the foundations of their supremacy on the island and beseeched their homeland for strong men to thoroughly colonize Sicily. One of the puzzles that has long been debated among archaeologists is the nature of the first Greek colonies on Sicily. Were the first settlers, the pioneers who came to Sicily, peaceful explorers who lived in harmony with the local inhabitants, the so-called Sicanians, or did they forcefully take control of the best land on the island? According to the accounts of ancient historians, the Greeks were belligerent people, unlike the Phoenicians who also settled on the island, although only for trade purposes. Greek settlers were described as being intent on owning arable land. While the Phoenicians built emporiums along the coast and were not interested in the interior, the Greeks tended to expand and take military control over vast areas. Ortygia is a small island adjacent to Sicily, and the first settlement of what would become the largest Sicilian colony of ancient times, Syracuse. Excavations under the present-day cathedral there, which incorporated the Greek temple of Athena, led to the discovery of an ancient indigenous colony that was supplanted in the 8th century BC by a Greek colony. Archaeologists were able to pinpoint the date after studying the type of pottery they found. Studies revealed that Greek settlers had driven out the native Sicanian peoples, conquered the city of Syracuse, and expanded beyond Ortygia into the mainland. The building boom the Greeks initiated may be found to this day in the still existing quarries that the Greeks later used to lock up prisoners of war. But people weren't constantly at war on Sicily. There were long, peaceful periods during which Greek settlers exchanged products and compared their artwork with Phoenician settlers and the Sicanians, thereby keeping the island humming with prolific cultural exchange. Syracuse, in the 4th century BC, was an enormous city with mighty fortresses and numerous monuments that were elegantly decorated. Among the most famous pieces is a Gorgon mask and the Venus Landolina. Across the canal on the mainland was the second part of the city, a city that had become the largest and most important in Sicily. Excavating here, in what is presumed to be the more recent quarters of the city, archaeologists came across a theater. Strange inscriptions engraved in stone appeared at various points. Translators soon realized that all those graffiti had something in common. They were names of gods and famous kings. But what was the relationship between them? Systematic excavation of the theater and reliefs revealed a strange symmetry between the points in which the inscriptions were found, which led them to unravel the mystery. The names had been engraved to distinguish the theater's various sections and seating arrangements. It was here that the premiere of one of the most representative dramas of Greek culture, The Persians by Aeschylus, was held. The play is about the great victory of the Greek city-states, united for once, over the militarily strong Persians, whom the Greeks defined as barbaric and lacking culture. The premiere at Syracuse meant that Sicily had become, over time, an integral part of Greece. After all, Aeschylus, like Archimedes, was a Siciliot, a Sicilian Greek, and spent most of his life at this theater. The theater symbolized the presence of Greeks on Sicily. The Phoenicians were primarily devoted to trade and spent little time on literature, and the Romans, who arrived later, preferred the oval-shaped amphitheater where they could watch gladiators in action. Perhaps the world's highest concentration of ancient Greek theaters is on Sicily, where culture was associated with wealth. This one, at Tindari, opens toward the sky and gives us a sense of how the Greeks attempted to create dramatic visual impact to intensify the pathos of their tragedies. One of the most spectacular Greek theaters on Sicily is undoubtedly the one at Taormina, dug into a promontory overhanging the sea. This one at Catania, at the foot of Mount Etna on the east coast of Sicily, is like a gem perfectly inserted into the city landscape. On the other side of the island was Agrigento, and along the way was a noted latifundium, a great landed estate with a magnificent home, almost a palace, and a rest stop, a so-called Filosofiana Statio. This place for centuries existed only in the pages of an antique guidebook called the Itinerarium Antonini, but eventually it started revealing traces of itself. In the 50s, archaeologists systematically began excavating the ruins 40 miles from Catania in the vicinity of Piazza Armerina. They came across a real treasure, the Villa del Casale, an owner's country house containing the largest, richest, and most complex set of late antiquity mosaics that have stood the test of time. Nearby, at a place called Sofiana, similar treasures were discovered, preserved over the centuries. Archaeologists unearthed some bricks there, stamped with a seal with the word philosophe impressed on it. By joining both words, we get Filosofiana, the ancient and wealthy landed estate described in the Itinerarium Antonini. This luxury and this concentration of mosaics, along with the Villa del Casale itself, was typical of the Romans, however, and not the Greeks. The Romans arrived on Sicily after the Greeks, So these finds actually date from the late antiquity period of the 4th century AD. Philosophiana, the estate's name, perhaps originated from the owner's interest in philosophy. Or he could have been an aristocrat involved in the circus business or gladiator contests. Perhaps he was a great merchant who traded in exotic animals. One of the largest and most famous mosaics found here is the so-called Great Hunt. The mosaic runs along a corridor measuring an amazing 216 by 16 feet. The same shapes appear in the xystus, the covered floor of the gymnasium. This other mosaic, found not far away, which modern scholars have called girls in bikinis, has led us to believe that a gymnastic competition was held in the corridor of the Great Hunt. Reaching Agrigento at the other end of the island, we find a valley studded with temples, many of which are miraculously still standing. This one, the Temple of Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri, was rebuilt with original material. Imagine, dozens of temples in a single valley. This great archaeological legacy was not the result of a discovery. It has always been there. Such a concentration of majestic public works has left scholars truly perplexed and not a little mystified. Archaeologists realize that the most important temples, like this one called the Temple of Concordia, or this imposing one, the Temple of Zeus Olympus, decorated with telemones, gigantic figures used as pillars over 23 feet high, were erected only a few years apart, around the middle of the 5th century BC. Who could have handled such a huge workload in such a short time? And where did all the money come from? Scholars looked for the answer in ancient books by Greek historians Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus. They speak about a tyrant from Agrigento called Theron, who a few years earlier had won a devastating war against the Phoenicians. The victory brought him riches. It also brought him an incredibly large number of slaves, so much so that some inhabitants of Agrigento owned over 500 of them. The slaves were obviously a great help in building a valley full of temples. This is what the Temple of Concordia would have looked like with its original colors in the 4th century BC. In fact, it was incorrectly believed that all Greek temples were white. The Temple of Concordia is a typical temple of the classical period, with 6 columns on the short sides and 13 on the long sides, surmounted by clean-shaped Doric capitals. Its base, made up of 4 steps, was designed to overcome the rises and drops in the rocky terrain. The poet Pindar said that Agrigento was the most beautiful city of mortals, and certainly the temples were its Doric glories. In a tranquil setting not far away, at Selenunte, also known as Selinus, one can find 3 temples in a row erected on level ground. They are ancient and majestic, and identified simply by letters of the alphabet, E, F, and G. Very little is known about them. The ruins of the most imposing one, Temple G, have given archaeologists a real mystery to unravel. The columns, ruined at the base, are partly smooth and partly fluted. Although the different styles were both used by the Greeks, in no temple were both styles used together. Archaeologists wondered about the reason for this mixture. It was certainly not for aesthetic reasons, since classical Greek art was based on stylistic consistency. They compared the design with building techniques used in those times. We know that columns were assembled in blocks, the so-called drums, one on top of the other, until they reached the capital, and only then fluted. Therefore, the column of Temple G may have been unfinished. But why was it never finished? Scholars found the answer in some diplomatic treaties between the Greeks and Phoenicians. Although Selenunte remained a Greek city, it came under Phoenician influence around 409 BC. That date marked a watershed in its history. In order to conquer Selenunte, the Phoenicians attacked it with overwhelming force and destroyed many of its monuments. Most likely, Temple G, still needing its final touches, was destroyed at that time. When the temples were standing in their full glory, however, they were a grand sight. Temple G was perfectly aligned with Temple E. The sacred complex that included a third temple called Temple F was erected on the city's eastern hill. Temple G was the largest of the three and measured 370 feet on the long sides and 177 feet on the short sides. Although this temple was built in the distant past, in the 6th century BC, it was one of the most regal of the Greek world and soared to nearly 100 feet in height. The size of Temple G, the city's pride, can be inferred by its columns, which themselves are almost 56 feet high. Their abacus, the square part of the capital that rests on the architrave, extended for an amazing 172 square feet. The majestic Temple G demonstrates the importance of the city of Selenunte, founded as a colony of another city called Megara Hyblia. However, Selenunte was developed more because of its two seaports. The wealth of the city encouraged a certain degree of sophistication in its architecture. This temple is truly one of a kind. You realize it when you enter the nave. The space inside, the heart of the temple, is strangely uncovered. Archaeologists wondered whether this temple had some function other than religious. Its grand size and importance seemed to suggest it. After studying an inscription found there, they figured out that it may have contained the treasury of Selenunte, like the main temples of other Sicilian cities. The central nave was arranged on two levels. The upper level, accessed by two side staircases, was not open to worshippers. Besides aesthetics, it had a more practical function. It was used for the routine upkeep of this high structure, particularly the colossal wooden trusses that supported the roof. The temple's cella housed the statue of the god, probably Apollo or perhaps Zeus. Among the ruins, archaeologists discovered only a headless bust, so the discussion remains open. The Acropolis, the highest part of the city, was where the well-preserved Temple C was located. The new Phoenician quarters were built in the vicinity of the Acropolis after Selenunte had come under their control. but the Greeks had decided to stay. And the Elimi, an indigenous population from nearby Segesta, later frequented the city. They often fought with the inhabitants of Selenunte, but at times also collaborated with them. In this connection, Greek historian Thucydides recalls the signing of a treaty between the two peoples that allowed them to intermarry. Thus, more than in any other place on Sicily, on this Acropolis, one could perceive that mixture of races and variety of backgrounds that make a culture great. Sicily. Its trade, riches, and elegant buildings made it the beating heart of Magna Graecia. Sicily, bridging continents and civilizations. A fertile and colorful land where long after Homer's time, the Greeks still believed the cattle of the sun gods roamed the hills. Sicily, a land coveted by many, yet ultimately controlled only by beneficent nature. Sicily, the jewel of the exotic ancient Mediterranean.